Good morning, everybody. It's 9:30 and we're about to start our Festspace conference 2022. I wonder if people can hear me and see me. Yes, thank you, Christina. Yeah. Okay, good, thank you. So we have a very busy day ahead of us. So I think without further ado, we will kick off proceedings. I'll start with a very brief introduction and let you know that my name is Bernadette Quinn and I am the Irish PI on the Festspace project. I've been tasked with welcoming you all this morning because we should have been welcoming you in person in Dublin this morning, but unfortunately that wasn't to be the case. However, we're very delighted to welcome you all online to our Festspace Conference 2022, and we're hoping for a lively day of discussions on festivals, public spaces in urban spaces and inclusivity in these very uncertain times. We have a very broad range of practitioners and academics signed up today, which is wonderful. And they come from our 5 project cities of Dublin, Barcelona, Glasgow, Gothenburg and London. But people with us today come from much further afield, and that's just wonderful. So we're delighted to see everybody here. I'm going to just make a few housekeeping notes. We're going to be recording, as Anna has already told us in the chat. So just please note that we will be recording and we will be making the recordings available later on through our website. For people who can't attend, and in order to keep our discussions going as widely as we could, we're asking you to tweet today and to use the hashtag Festspace, please. All attendees are going to be muted, but we really want you to engage with us and to give comments and questions and queries into the chat, please. And the chairs of the various sessions will pick them up as we move through the day. So please engage with us. We very much want that. We're asking people to keep their cameras off as well, because we have a lot of people registered. So just for connectivity, please keep the cameras off. So today's event, and indeed our project, is of course the result of cooperation between European countries, and we have worked very well together, sharing knowledge, sharing insights, and we're concerned about big ideas about belonging and sociability in European public space. So it's only appropriate that we start our proceedings today by me asking us all if we could possibly take a moment's silence to remember our friends and colleagues in Ukraine who are experiencing war and such dreadful hardship at the moment, and take that moment, you know, to hope that a way forward for peace will be found soon. Thank you everybody for being respectful and just sharing that short period of silence. Now, without any further ado, I'm going to hand you over to our project leader, Professor David McGillivray, who's going to give you a broader introduction to the day and an overview of some of the work we've been doing on the Festspace project. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you, Bernadette, and welcome to everyone for joining this. We're describing it as the final conference for the Festspace project. We actually do have a little bit more time to complete our project, but this was intended to be the final one in person in Dublin. I'm actually in Dublin in person, albeit we're online, so it's slightly meta for me today. In front of us, I'm just going to do a slight overview of the project first, but I just wanted to reiterate the programme for people so that they could see what we're going to be covering today. So after this introduction, we're going to be looking at hearing from some insights from the Festspace team from each of the 5 partners, as Bernadette has mentioned. We're going to have a little bit of discussion after that, and then we're going to have a little break, but then go into 8 excellent papers, so kind of more traditional academic papers focusing upon the issues associated with festivals, public space and inclusivity. Then we've got quite a good time for lunch, and then we're going to come back. And the afternoon session is more focused on a kind of practitioner policy sort of discussion environment. It's something we've done throughout the project. I'm very keen to hear from those festival makers, policy makers, designers of urban space about their understanding of debates about inclusivity in space. And then we're going to have breakout rooms where we're going to ask everyone here to participate. So the kind of main area where we can get you to feed in, and we're going to have breakout rooms where you're going to address a few questions relating to the topics. And then we'll just close it and pull it all together. So in the next few minutes, I just want to provide an overview of the project, what we were intending to do, what we've achieved, and some of the obstacles on the way, which some of those will be pretty obvious to you. As already said, please engage with the hashtag, please engage with the project, look at material on the website afterwards to see, get a bigger understanding of what we've done. So I'm the project lead for the project out of these 5 partners at University of the West of Scotland. So this is, we may have colleagues from HERA with us today. This project is about festivals, events and inclusive public space in Europe. And it was part of a humanities in the European research area funded project, which's focus was all about public spaces. So there are a range of projects, as you'll see on the right-hand side, 20 transnational projects across a variety of countries, looking at this issue from very different perspectives. And we came at it looking at the context of festivals and events and their relationship with public space, because as a group of researchers, we'd been aware and writing about these things previously, and we felt it was a really appropriate funding stream to look at the context of festivals and events as they interact with public spaces. When we started, we set out to look at these aim and questions. So very much looking at the way in which festivals and events affect inclusivity in relation to public space across Europe. And that was about the kind of types of festival spaces that we have existing, because there are many in different public spaces in different parts of Europe. How these festival events might affect who uses them, so who comes into public space, how they interact within those spaces, how they encounter people within the space, and also the longer term kind of enduring effects on inclusivity of festival events being held in these spaces. So that was our kind of original kind of objectives for the project. And as Bernadette said, we kind of created a project across 5 European cities: Glasgow, Dublin, Gothenburg, Barcelona, and London. And that's 5 PIs who you'll hear from today in the next session. And then also a range of associate partners. I think it's a really important part of both the funding, but also the nature of the project. Working with a variety of public sector organizations, local authorities, charitable trusts, urban designers, artists, creatives, festivals themselves. So across the range of partners we have here, lots of variety within that, that helped us to try and deliver on the project objectives. And again, we set out to do a range of different methodologies, trying to map the types of festival spaces that exist within each of the cities that are at the focus of our research, looking to do in-depth, long-term work with particular spaces, whether that be parks or street spaces or squares, but also particular festivals that maybe we're focusing upon an inclusive agenda. We also then, did a lot of work around about kind of working with institutional and non-institutional actors to understand the relationship between planning, delivering events, but also design and kind of context of social policy. Also looking to do much more work around about audience participant interviews. Again, something that we'll talk about in a moment was obviously more difficult because of the experiences of a coronavirus pandemic that of course impacted on our project. And finally, a kind of process where I'm much more kind of been involved much more in the participatory planning dimensions of how festival events are planned in and around public spaces, and actually how these public spaces are designed in some respects to reflect an ability to host festivals and events in an effective manner. Of course, we can't really talk about the project, which has been run since 2019, without reflecting on some implications with the pandemic that we have experienced and some are, of course, still experiencing. Many festival events, of course, most were cancelled or postponed across our case cities, albeit you'll hear this morning of some cities and some environments where festivals and events continued because of their importance in different forms. Of course, we then started to pivot the research to look more at the kind of the focus on the creative, but also the digital response to the pandemic in terms of festivity and the way in which actually new spaces perhaps were being created, new digital public spaces maybe became available, and the way we used existing public spaces as a means of hosting particular types of events during that period. And so that became a focus of our work, obviously, from March 2020 onwards. And we actually have extended the project for our funders, HERA, in order to be able to reflect the return of in real life festivals and events. And that's something that clearly we're seeing at the moment in the cities that are the focus of our work. And then just briefly, I just want to finish this session just by talking a little bit about what we've tried to do in terms of communicating the work and sharing that work more really actively out there in the world. One of those is around about very regular kind of blogging and interaction with media to try and to not just reflect what our findings we're doing, but actually also to help talk about the kind of, especially during the pandemic times, some of the ways in which we were seeing changes happening to how public spaces were being used, how festivals and events were able to function or otherwise, and also some of the major challenges faced by festival producers and the like in terms of actually being able to continue their existence during that period. So trying to be proactive at sharing the kind of work that we were finding, but also, contributing, advocating for the festival and event sector within that very difficult period we've gone through. We also wanted to impact on policy and practice, and so in a range of ways we've done that. And again, you can find more of that information on our website. But colleague Andrew Smith, who we're here for, talking to a UK Parliament in terms of committees around about formal evidence around about the future of music festivals, looking at the context of events in London's parks in terms of a report that's been influential around about the way in which we see our parks being used for festival and events. We're also producing an inclusive cultural festivals and public space design guide, which we want to push out there to work with festival organisers, public sector organisations and the like. We also, of course, as you would expect, kind of disseminating through our more traditional academic outputs. So again, a host of publications, including an edited book which will be coming out soon, which is an open access book, which is one of those kind of key features of what we try to do with the project, is ensure that our outputs are as accessible as possible to a wider population other than those simply in the academic community. So we have a Festivals in the Cities book coming out soon, and a range of articles that again we'll be able to share with you. You can go and click through and interact with as you wish. And finally, one of the other things that we've been very keen to do throughout the project is also try and share our work through a kind of filmic and visual representation. So again, we'll be sharing some of this later in the day through some of the links, but lots of films from the project, including a final film that we just produced, organised by our Barcelona partners. But each city, we have short films trying to communicate the sorts of issues around about festivals, events and inclusivity. So that's something that, again, hopefully you'll have time today and later to go and have a look at and get a sense of what we've done in each of our individual cities. So what I'm going to do now, so that was just a kind of brief overview of the project, what we set out to try and achieve. And what we're going to try and do in the next section now, so the main part of the morning, is just go through each city, and each city will then provide a reflection on the work that it's been doing and share some of the findings. And one of the things that we've tried to do within this next stage is share those findings in different ways. So we'll have maps being shown, we'll have a kind of photo gallery being shown, we'll have a film being shown in one of the presentations too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to my colleague Teresa Ryan, who's going to chair this session, and Teresa will then introduce everyone and will take us through, and hopefully you enjoy hearing a bit more detailed insights about each of the cities that have been involved in the project. Teresa.
Thanks, David. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to join you today and to chair the first session of our Festspace conference. In this session, as David mentioned, we're going to hear from the 5 partners involved in the Festspace project, and they're going to give us insights from their research on festivals, public space and inclusivity in their respective cities. So we're going to be hearing from Gothenburg, we're going to be hearing from Glasgow, Barcelona, Dublin and also London. Our first speakers will present for 15 minutes each, and our final speaker, Andrew, has a little longer because he's going to share a film with us, and he's going to talk about parks in London. So in the interest of time, each presenter will introduce the next, and we ask that speakers please stick rigidly to their allotted time. We have a lot to get through today, so just try and keep time as much as possible. I will interject near the end of your presentations to remind you when your time is coming close to the end. We're not going to take questions during the presentation. You'll notice that your microphones are all muted, but we really welcome questions in the chat. So we, as Bernadette said, we really hope that you'll engage with us and just post your questions. And then we'll have time at the end and we'll get to those questions. And if for any reason we run out of time, we'll answer them in the chat anyway. So again, just to remind you to use the hashtag Festspace and, just to engage as much as possible over the course of the day. Okay, so now it gives me great pleasure to welcome our first speaker, which is Christina Lindstrom from the University of Gothenburg.
Thank you, Teresa, and I hope that you can hear me all. I will. Perfect. I will share my screen. Hopefully it works. Do you see my presentation? No. Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. So I will start off with a picture of my hometown, Gothenburg, which is also the focus of the sub-project I'm working with. Gothenburg is the second city of Sweden, and it is also, like many other cities, a city of events. This is a picture of an annual cultural festival that is hosted in the city center in, I think about, it depends a little bit on the year, but around 50 different spaces in the city center of Gothenburg. And I think it illustrates in a good way the quite obvious that, and something that we know from many cities around, if not the world, so at least the western part of the world. And that is that when we talk about urban sustainable development or urban inclusive development, we also tend to talk about how public space festivals and events can leverage such sustainable development. And we know from many examples from our specific project and from other projects and practitioners and research and so on, that there are quite a few good examples out there, and there are quite a lot of strategic thinking. But it also raises a question about the legacy of these events. And sometimes you kind of suspect that it is a rather vague assumptions around the notion of inclusivity in relationship to the legacy of these public space festivals and events. And it raises a question that has been the core of my part of the research and what we have done in the Gothenburg project, and that is how do cities use public space festivals to foster social and cultural inclusion? And I'm specifically interested in the festival governance and policy making. That is sort of where the decisions are made. So that's the core of everything. I think it's really, I strongly argue that it's very important to understand governance and policy making in order to understand how cities are dealing with the notion of inclusivity in relationship to public space festivals and events. So what I would like to do today during my brief talk is to unpack festival governance and policy making and propose an analytic framework that we could use to critically analyze and understand festival governance and policy making. And also, if there are any practitioners listening, I think this could also be an inspiration how you can use a framework to understand how you are working and how you can shift towards perhaps more sustainable strategies and practices. So first, something about the concept or notion of governance. It's one of those concepts like sustainability, like innovation. We have a number of those concepts that are rather, it's used in many different ways. It's important to understand that governance today is a form of public-private civic society policy making where stakeholders deliberate on and take action to achieve common goals, or at least that's what they want to do. And it is a complex network of stakeholders that develop and apply policies through power, through resources, and resources, as you know, might be financial resources, it might be knowledge, it might be other things. And they apply policies through rules, regulations, law, and through coordinating themselves and through collaboration. And we can see that when we are talking about governance, on the one hand, we are talking about what we normally refer to as new governance, state adaptation to economic and political context, but also about we are talking about the social capital and community-driven innovation, and that's something I think we have seen a lot in the work that we have done in Festspace, and this divide is very. It's very obvious that it's a divide, and it's also a struggle between different values. It's also important to bear in mind that in this complex network of governance, we see soft spaces and fuzzy boundaries, meaning that there are governance spaces and governance boundaries that are unclear, and where questions and themes and topics tend to disappear or fall in between chairs, and that could be extremely dangerous looking at the fulfillment of different policy goals. And further, we have to keep in mind that the state responsibility, even though governance is about a great number of stakeholders, the state responsibility is still there, and it's a critical thing, especially in the wake of sustainable development. So we need to scrutinize the state responsibility when we talk about governance, and also we could think about governance analysis like we need to move beyond the whole network of governance, and we need to apply a meta-governance analytic framework in order to fully understand the practices and the procedures of governance, and of course to explore how change can be facilitated. So we tend to perhaps look too close into specific parts or processes in governance, but that's not enough if you want to understand how governance can change and become more sustainable, or to be able to foster sustainable development in a better way. So if we look specifically at festival governance and public policy insights, we did a critical policy analysis with Bernadette Quinn as the lead author of that paper we published in 2021. And what we could see, the insights we made in that study was that festival governance and policy making cut across several policy domains, and they look different in different cities because we have different administrative structures, and they make it quite complicated to compare actually. But we talk about cultural, we talk about the social policy domain, the public space or urban design, tourism, just to mention the big policy domains that we could see. We saw that festivals are valued, but there is an area of policy approaches. So we could clearly see this soft and fussy governance that I was mentioning before. We could see that it was a strong rhetoric around cultural inclusion. but less evidence that policymakers are coherently linking festivals with cultural inclusion. So cultural inclusion is something you talk a lot about, but not necessarily clearly specify how you should work with it within festival in festival policies and practice. We could also see that big events tend to align with the tourism policy domain, and smaller grassroots community festivals tend to align with diversity and inclusion and more the social policy domain. And we could also finally see that public space is recognized as something that is enabling festivals to meet the policy objectives, but not necessarily linked to festival strategies. So the research implications from this work was that festival policy making need to be more holistic, and public space need better policy understanding how festivals in public spaces can facilitate cultural inclusions. So clearly it's a divide, it's a fuzzy, and it is a soft governance that we could see here. So based on that, how can we make a shift towards something that is more robust and sustainable? Well, what I would like to do here today very briefly is to propose a public space festival management analytic framework shaped for and through use, because festivals are something that is happening in time and in space, so we have to be aware of that it's constantly changing. But in order to understand the inner circle here, the public sphere, where things are happening, where communication are taking place, where information sharing, where discursive practices are, where you see discursive practices and participation. In order to understand what is going on there, why it is going on, and who is taking part and who is excluded, we need to move beyond this very core of action and look at, one, the institutions and the institutional context. That is the role of the state. We need to understand laws and routines and processes. And if I take the Swedish and Gothenburg example, we have a strong right to public access here, as just to mention something. And we have a strong by law regulated comprehensive planning, which makes it which set the scene, so to speak, when we deal with public space for festival purposes and for other purposes. Secondly, we need to understand the drivers and influences, and that's politics, economy, social, technology, the environment, and so on. And I'm sure that you can think about many global external drivers that we have to deal with in festival governance in order to cope with the reality that we are dealing with today. Just to mention one example, in the post-pandemic festival context, we have, for example, to deal with the digitalization and the development of hybrid events and what it means for sustainable development in the city. Thirdly, we have to understand and critically analyze the governments, the business, the community interests. For example, the tourism community divide that I already mentioned. So this is one.
Left, Christina.
Thank you. This is one brief example of how we need to scrutinize festival governance in order to understand how cities are dealing with the notion of inclusivity in relation to public space festivals. So then we have the situation with governance response to the pandemic or the post-pandemic. And what we can see here is that the level of societal lockdown, meaning different reactions to the absence of festivals among the residents, also is something that has shaped governance in the wake of the pandemic. And we can see that government support, it's about regulations, it's financial support, it's mostly incremental and some long-term. We see a lot of digital alternatives, and I think this is extremely interesting from an inclusive perspective, because does hybridization of festivals necessarily lead to inclusion? We have a tech determinism here that we have to be careful, and that needs to be understood from a governance perspective. And then we have the big question, do crises trigger governance, innovation, and sustainability? Yes, we like to think so. But I think that the observations that we have made in the project and that have been made elsewhere is that it tends to be about surviving, and it tends to be about incremental support rather than about long-term thinking. So in the light of that, I would finally like to propose a different analytic framework that could be merged or with the framework I already presented, perhaps. And that is based on the assumption that in uncertain times, when we have to deal with significant changes in the world. We had the climate before the pandemic, then we had the pandemic, and now we have an awful situation with war, a war going on in Europe. In the light of that, we have to think more about transformative festival governance. So we have to be more systemic and holistic. We have to think crucially about the role of the state and the responsibility of the state. We have to build an evidence base in policy making. We have to be reflective and critical and implement as much reflective and critical learning as possible into festival governance. And finally, we have to work with innovation, or perhaps even more with experimentation. And I think that we have quite a lot of good examples of how grassroots initiatives during the pandemic, for example, could be an inspiration for policymakers and city governance. And I think this, finally, as a final word, I could say, I think this whole project where we work close to practitioners is a good example of how you can elaborate with different alternative forms of festival and events, and how governance and policymakers need to or should listen and take inspiration from projects like this. And by that, I need to stop to share, and I would like to pass on the word to David. And David is the project leader of the Festspace project, is going to talk about the project that has been based in Glasgow, and or in Scotland, sorry. And I think you already know him from the introduction. So please, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christina. Yeah, so I'm going to talk for just over 10 minutes about a specific context from the Glasgow project and the sort of Glasgow findings. Obviously, with all the projects that you're going to hear from today, you know, we've looked at different spaces, we've looked at different types of festivals and the relationship between the two. So today I'm going to focus on festivals, neighbourhoods and public spaces, and that's specifically a particular neighbourhood in Glasgow, what we've been looking at quite carefully over the last 2 or 3 years, which is a place-based festival. It's absolutely about the kind of relationship between that place and the specificities of that place, the spaces used for in relation to the festival within that space, and the intended outcomes of that approach. So it's a space and a festival that isn't run by a local government. It isn't one of the traditional festivals where people are looking to attract a touristic audience. which you may hear from some of the other festivals that we're going to hear about today. This is actually much more about the kind of focus on one place and the kind of benefits that a festival can bring to that particular neighbourhood and area. So the focus of that is going to be the area of Govan Hill, which is a part of the south side of the city of Glasgow. You can see in the map in the middle, and I'm going to share this mainly through photo images, and I'll talk to some of those, so you can keep yourself engaged by looking at the images. Govan Hill is a very specific neighbourhood with very specific issues, opportunities, and challenges. It's the most diverse community outside of London. A huge number of nationalities and languages spoken in this area. It's very diverse in that sense. It's very congested in terms of quite poor quality of housing. Some issues around about crime, some issues around about significant expectation around about migrants who've come to this area of the city for a long, long time. So it's described often as the Ellis Island of Scotland. But also, and in the context of some of the representations of this place that you're seeing in front of you and some of the newspaper headlines, issues of racism have been really prominent in this area for some time, and very much kind of focusing often on the sort of blaming of the local community in this area in terms of some of the kind of ways in which the media representation of this area has come through. So very much you could see this in the kind of terms that Vacantes uses, being a space of kind of territorial stigma. An area that has been perceived very poorly. This area is the largest Roma community in the whole of the UK too. And again, in 2015-16, some really bad press around about the area and a kind of stigma around about it, very racialized stigma, led to there being the development of a festival in this area called the Govan Hill International Festival and Carnival. But in some respects, that festival and the kind of creation of that festival is related to a past since 2001 onwards of an occupation of a Govan Hill bath, so one of the local baths in the area, the swimming pool in the area. In 2001, there was an occupation where people came onto the streets and really occupied that space, and including the pool, for a long time in order to fight for that community facility in the area. So you can see on the images some of these: Save Our Pool, Southside Against Closure, etc. And from that kind of occupation, then a whole process of community development and activism has continued on, and this relates to the formation and establishment of the festival and its purpose and its role within this particular community. So, community trust, community development organisations forming as anchor organisations to try and really solidify a set of activities in that place. Here's some Romana Labs, a kind of Roma voice organisation representing these diverse communities in this area and fighting for their rights and recognition and representation. And that led in 2017 to the first Govan Hill International Festival and Carnival. So this case, if you like, and this is a reflection of the creation and establishment as a festival as a kind of very actual political act, quite a kind of radical act, as a way of tackling kind of representations and reflecting, especially racialized representations of this area. So it's about kind of how can you take a festival and a carnival in this context and use it as a mechanism to demonstrate the kind of showcase the successes, the vibrancy of the area, of the people, to increase tolerance around about understandings of the people living in the area with each other and also for externally. So the carnival in 2017 very much focused on kind of building on the Rock Against Racism, and there was festivals held in the Govan Hill area, in Queen's Park, which is one of the main public spaces in that area, and was very successful, and is something that has continued on since then. And what they do and what the festival really tries to do is very much work with the place and with the spaces in and around about that Govan Hill. It's a 1 mile kind of area, and ensure that we draw as many of the communities that live in that area into the festival. And I'll talk a little bit more just as we go through about how that's done and how that leads to a kind of enduring and sustainable dimension to the festival activities. So again, you see some of the images here, making sure that the area in terms of the window dressings, that it's very presenting itself well, very much reflecting on the people and a lot of the artwork that takes place within the festival itself. And like some of the other festivals that we may hear about today, one of the kind of key aspects of this festival is about visibility and relationship with reclaiming space and using streetscapes in particular, but also other spaces as a means of promoting and showcasing the diversity of the area. And so on the left-hand side, you see the parade. So one of the carnival parade is a kind of key feature of the festival since its origins in 2017, and has continued on in 2021. It returned post-COVID, and again, very much that demonstration on the streets to try and demonstrate the kind of area's strengths, its assets, its successes. Very much a message of anti-racism. And again, what's unique, I think, about this festival is that it's openly anti-racist. This isn't something that's a political message that's hidden behind it. It's very open about that being part of the agenda for hosting the festival. But what you see is these other spaces in the Govan Hill area being used and being available for visibility. So an old bandstand in Queen's Park on the bottom right picture that you see, and the local politician who happens to be our First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, often talks and opens at that event. The other thing that I think is important, again, to all our projects, but is about the kind of complexity of the spaces that are chosen as a means of hosting events within this particular festival and event. So you see lots of areas of Govan Hill being used to host outdoor public events, outdoor arts events and festivals. So you see little garden spaces, little green spaces in and around particular parts of Govan Hill, where perhaps particular communities have been used to occupying, being there. So important to the Slovak community, for example. So events held in particular areas where people know that they are likely to be congregating. Lots of street activities and events, because again, part of the Roma community, some of the cultures to have people out on streets and to be around streets in evenings and otherwise. And again, so thinking very carefully about the specificity and the complexity of the spaces that people feel comfortable in. So at some levels, you want to bring things into kind of big public spaces like the park. So Queen's Park is one of those. And in another context, you want very unique understandings of where the spaces that people will feel comfortable and are likely to reach them in respect of some of the messages that are being promoted around about this particular festival too. So there's very much that complexity, and that actually was very important when we thought about the context and what we looked at in the context of COVID. So obviously COVID meant that big gatherings of people were prohibited. The carnival couldn't take place. The parade, that very big demonstration of an anti-racist message in this community, couldn't take place. And one thing, really interesting things about the way the organisers considered this was to create a street music festival in the period 2019 and 20. Both years a street music festival was held in and around the streets of the community, COVID friendly in terms of managing social distancing and the numbers, but actually trying to kind of, again, host music activities all around, celebrating the diversity of the musical cultures and styles of populations living in the Govan Hill area, and doing so as a way of ensuring that the event did take place. And I think it's something we'll hear from our Barcelona partners, is that the cultural importance of festival events means that even despite COVID, many of these events people felt needed to happen. They needed to happen because of their importance politically, or for that place, or for what was necessary in terms of the kind of agendas facing communities living in those areas. And that encounter that we talk about quite a lot in our project, and interaction between difference, something that's very important for the organisers of this particular event. And they showed that real creativity and adaptation to ensure that the Street Music Festival happened. And the way that they managed that, which again I think really interesting in respect to space, was in managing that by actually inviting artists and paying artists as well, which is a really important dimension of what they did here, to actually perform in spaces around about people's homes, around people's streets, just outside of any kind of small cafes or anywhere where there's a kind of public space that people could use. It was used as a way of hosting music, bringing to life the community during a time where it was very difficult because of the COVID restrictions that were taking place. So you see in the images here, people someone playing a harp outside their doorsteps, a Roma community band playing outside in a public space, someone playing down in their kind of outside their house in the sort of basement area, and someone just outside on the street corners. It's kind of interesting.
2 minutes, David.
Yep, interesting creative way of thinking about continuing to have festivity, continuing to share, and continuing to celebrate the musical cultures as a means of ensuring that the community has a chance to interact with each other during those really difficult times. And I think, again, one of the features of festivals and their relationship with inclusivity and their relationship with space is about the ability for these to endure. So we often see festivals as a break from our kind of regular lives and otherwise, and certainly the International Festival and Carnival in Govan Hill certainly does that and really emphasises that celebration on the streets, very noisy, very colourful, very vibrant, but also the really important durable dimension of linking the festival activity to community development work, to the work of representative organisations supporting Roma communities and the like throughout the year, so that the festival is just a showcase of things that are happening all the time. So very much like a catalyst for some of the other community activities, and just a range of these organisations displayed here on the screen in terms of the sorts of ongoing activity that build up to the carnival. So that idea of a carnival being sort of celebration of things like, if you think about Mardi Gras, where the crews create artistic work and engage in activity all year, and then that's celebrated via the carnival parade. Very similar in the context of Govan Hill, where all the diverse communities already working together, young and old, into generational projects, artistic projects, then being celebrated at the parade. And again, as I said, this year that all returned, the parade, and so we actually were able to kind of do a lot more work on understanding the importance of the visible demonstration. So I'm gonna leave it there. Hopefully that's just on time, and I'm happy to answer questions about that in the discussion afterwards.
Okay. Now, can everybody see and hear me? And can you see my screen?
We can, Bernadette. Yeah.
All right, good. So David has given us this interesting neighbourhood perspective. Now I'm going to ask us to zone right back out again to the city level, and I'm going to focus in on Dublin. Now, why can't I? Whoops, yes, sorry. Yeah, so so I'm giving us a citywide perspective. There's probably not much need for me to remind people in this room how important public space is and how it matters for human well-being and the livability of towns and cities. And there's a growing awareness of this now at policy level everywhere. Public space in Dublin is a commodity, a resource that's highly sought after and hotly contested. I don't know if people in the room are familiar with the Dublin situation, but I'm very much setting our work in the broader context of debates going on in the city around public space. So there's a lot of debate at the moment about how Dublin is experiencing tensions over who has the right to the city, who is the city for. There are discussions about privileging vehicles over people, about privileging hotels over cultural infrastructure. That's a very lively debate at the moment, and I think that what we're talking about fits right in the centre of that. Very relevant is this idea that festivalisation is continuing apace, and we see that very much in Dublin, where while arts festivals go back a long time in Dublin, we've seen a strong increase in festivals and events of all kinds in recent times, and we're seeing those being used very strongly to further economic agenda and tourism agenda. So that's another context for our work. A third important context for our work in the city is the fact that Dublin has seen an increasingly cultural diversity characterise its population in recent decades. So in contrast to other European cities, this is a relatively new phenomenon for us, that our population has become quite culturally diverse in quite a rapid space of time. So all of these contexts, of course, provide major challenges for our city government as they try to make the city livable, make it sustainable, and make it engaging. And the COVID-19 pandemic has only heightened the issues and the challenges that the city faces in this regard. And I think many cities face the same challenges. So Dublin is not particularly exceptional, but these are all the case. So all of those contexts then make it really important that we ask questions about festivals, and we ask questions about what role can festivals play in promoting livability, in allowing people to engage and own and feel they have a right to the space of the city. So the data, like everybody else, we had several strands to our work. But today I'm going to bring us into the city centre, and I'm going to use data that we gathered from festival goers. So I'm giving a perspective from the festival goers' point of view. We worked at 5 festivals pre-COVID from mid-2019 to February 2020, and we were in 4 outdoor and 1 semi-indoor outdoor space. So those spaces were Merrion Square, Smithfield Square, and the Victorian Market in Smithfield Square, Meeting House Square and St. Patrick's Park. So those spaces are kind of also give an insight into the different kinds of spaces we have in the city. The traditional city parks inside the Georgian Square, Smithfield being historically a very important square in terms of festivities in the city, but a more recently regenerated square, multi-purpose and now residential area. And then Meeting House Square inside Temple Bar, the cultural quarter, much renowned as an example of rejuvenated city district, and Meeting House Square is a square that has been evolved to hold events. So we're drawing on 110 site-specific semi-structured conversations that we had, which actually brought us into contact with about 150 people, where we had conversations lasting between 3 and 15 minutes on site during the festivals. We also did observations and key informed interviews, but it's really the data from the audiences that we're looking at today. So these were the festivals: Hotter Than July in Smithfield, the Dublin Homecoming, which was an event to welcome and celebrate the victorious Dublin GAA football team that had won 5 times in a row. Culture Night, which is a citywide event, but we just looked at the events that happen in Meeting House Square. It's an annual, big, large-scale event. Stokerland, which is a part of a bigger tourism-oriented Bram Stoker Festival, which happens at Halloween, and Chinese New Year, which this particular year happened in the city's beautiful Victorian market down in Smithfield. So I'm not saying that they're representative of the festivals in the city, but they give us an idea of the broad diversity of the kinds of festivals that we have. All of them are publicly funded. All of them were free. They cross the variety of community, arts, cultural, ethnic. One of our early findings actually about festivals in the city was the difficulties we had in trying to get an overall sense of festival activity in the city. We had a lot of help inside City Council to try and paint a picture really of what was going on in terms of governance, in terms of activity on the ground, but we found difficulties with gaps in data, availability of data, the number of different bodies that are involved in managing the spaces, in funding the festivals, and in terms of identifying the city's thinking about festivals. We found that very difficult, and it's an ongoing challenge for us. So in terms then of deriving some findings from talking to people in festival spaces, just some points that I'll try to run through quickly. Firstly, and very strongly, public spaces matter to people. We're in a city with changing demographics, a move to much denser urban housing, a much denser urban living. And so people with varying connections to the city, whether they're long-term residents, recent residents, living in neighbouring suburbs, in neighbouring counties, people want to be in the city. That's the bottom line. They want to be in the city and they expect to be in the city. And they don't want to be in the city just to consume or to shop. In fact, we know that people are shopping online. They don't want to be in the city just to work. We know that many people are working from home now, and they don't want to be in the city just to pass through it. They want to be there, just to be, to relax, enjoy, to learn about the city, to share it with others, to spend time with others there. And they want to celebrate, to feel pride in the city, to express support and appreciation for that Dublin team, for example. Now, I know that none of this is particularly new, but I mean, a point that we would make is that this understanding, this conceptualization of the citizen and their needs, I think could be more fully encapsulated in public policy narratives around how we develop the city. And public space then, of course, is where people can be and where they can do all of these things. So events then in public spaces really offer a way into the city. They help people connect with the city. So we found people telling us about how being in a festival offers a new perspective on the city. So we had people telling us, as they stood and watched, they spotted things they hadn't seen before. They remembered things they had done as a child. The experience was very sensuous, very affective. So people were engaging in a very embodied way with the city, through the sounds and tastes and smells and sights of what was going on around them. I mean, people familiar with the literature and people who are familiar with working in festivals know that festivals bring spaces to life. They transform space. But animation, which is the term we use, I really think it inadequately captures what actually happens. And as a further academic task, I think digging into that concept deserves more attention. Social interactions, festivals is an opportunity for generation of social interactions, no doubt. And post-pandemic, of course, social scarring is something that we are concerned about. So Florida, Rodriguez Pose and Storper have written about this. So, we don't have to wear masks in Dublin anymore, and yet a lot of people are still wearing masks. We are able to go to restaurants now and to socialise, but some of us are a little bit nervous. And in this context, I think the city can acknowledge that festivals take on a renewed societal role in this respect. Now, in our data, like many studies before, we find a lot of evidence of bonding. So actually a lot of our people were attending in family groups, actually not so much friend groups, but family groups. And there was a great deal of bonding going on where people were spending quality time with people they knew. Not so much evidence of encountering others in the data that we were gathering, in casual encounters, building new friendships or new relationships. Now, those casual encounters, however, very, very strongly fed into building intercultural awareness. So as I've already said, we've got this growing diverse population, and we met people who showed a huge openness, huge curiosity, appetite, awareness for learning about new cultures. This came through really strongly in our data. At the same time, among people who come from different ethnic backgrounds and are now calling Dublin their home, huge interest and desire, really deeply felt wish to maintain and celebrate and share their diverse practices, whether it was food or craft or art or traditions or language. And we found festivals like Hotter Than July and the Chinese New Year and even the Dublin Homecoming really creating opportunities, really, really importantly, for people to be able to do this. So overall, we would say that festivals create really positive experiential settings, that the city needs to take note of. Now, were festivals inclusive practices? Were they inclusive spaces? Well, everything I've been saying so far, I think, says that festivals and events are a practice through which people claim space and the right to the city, most definitely. But whether they are whether they're fully inclusive is something we have not yet fully decided. So we found that festivals tended to cater for certain kinds of cohorts, so for family or for sports fans or for older people, and perhaps there's maybe an inevitability about this, and maybe we can talk about this later. Although we did find some, like Stokerland, for example, that was really trying to facilitate openness and inclusion through its site design. For example, Chinese New Year was really facilitating intergenerational, as Hotter Than July was really working with its site design. Inclusivity is a very complex concept. It depends on perspective, we found. And our participants didn't think so much about ethnicity. They thought more about access, or they thought about ability. They thought about it relative to self. We found a lot of exclusions. Our people were very white. They were very family oriented. We had age cohorts missing. We found that online ticket distribution, people thought sometimes to be exclusionary. We found uneven distribution of festivals across city spaces and across the times of the year. All of these, I think, are issues that need to be looked at further. We found a lot of tensions, people telling us about tensions. People don't like over-commercialization. They like their public spaces and their festivals to be easy places to be. There are tensions evident, revealed in our data. Now, nothing at all like on the scale like we might be used to seeing in Edinburgh, for example, if any Edinburgh people in the room don't mind me saying that. Nothing on that sort of scale, but there are definitely tensions that people were able to reveal to us, but nothing that we could see wasn't solvable, through discussion and management. But I'm just going to move straight to my last slide, which is I've called solutions, even though I don't really have solutions as such, because I think this is a big issue for the city, and I think what I'm really advocating for here is that we would mainstream debates around how festivals in public space can foster dialogue and interaction between different cultures. I'm advocating that we mainstream that debate much more centrally than is the case at the moment. As I say, we've made a lot of progress recently, actually, encouraged by the pandemic. For example, to take vehicles off the streets, that's the cycle lane image I have there. And we have really moved forward, I think, with that. And we've got local authorities everywhere around the country now actually actioning things like that. We've big debates going on around revitalising inner urban areas and the centre of towns. I'd like to see the same kind of debate happening now about the recreational function of public space and festivals inside the recreational dimensions of public space. To do that, I think we'd need a much better acknowledgement that festivals and public space are part of our city's cultural infrastructure, which brings me back to, one of the problematic issues that I raised at the start, which is some would argue that the city's cultural infrastructure is under threat because of other perspectives on how the city should be used for commercial purposes largely. So we need a discussion and acknowledgement of how festivals are part of cultural infrastructure. We see some wonderful practice on the ground in terms of festive practices, but these need to be supported. They are supported, but they need perhaps to be better supported, and perhaps more through multi-annual funding and easier form-filling processes, so that the artistic people can spend more time doing their artistic practices. And we need ways of sharing and disseminating and networking among the festival sector in the city. I think we need a clearer governance framework. Christina earlier talked about soft spaces and fuzzy boundaries. We found an awful lot of that in Dublin, which I think could be improved. We need more evidence-based policy making, so we need more data gathering, clearer access to data. We need evaluation, I think, of what's being invested. And I think we just need closer consideration of the potential alignment between festivals, public space and inclusion, because definitely this can yield a lot of benefit for the city. And I'll leave it there. So Muile Buikas, everybody. Thank you very much.
Hopefully you can see me and hear me. Hello from Barcelona. So my name is Alba Colombo. I'm from the Open University of Catalunya, Universitat Oberta de Catalunya, and I'm the PI of the Barcelona team of the Festspaces. Hopefully the Bernadette and David get safe. I think Teresa is also in the same building, but we see soon from you and hear soon from you. So I take over at this time. So I'm also representing a team of Barcelona researchers that I have seen that some of them are here with us today. So I'm doing this research as a team leader, but we have Maite Puigdevall and Joan Pujolà, colleagues and professors of my department. Also, we have Julie Wilson from the Department of Economics. Then we have two assistant researchers, Laura Lamas and Xavier Villanueva. And then we have also PhD students and ex-PhD students, Maite Lupton and Jordi Oliva. This is our team, research team. Therefore, we are a group of people doing this. So today I will present to you. I don't know if you can go further. Exactly. We presented what we have been doing in the frame of Festspaces project. As you can see here in this slide, so we developed 4 main outcomes. The first one have been developed during the pandemic. As you know, in Spain, we had a strong, long lockdown, and we have developed a huge database of cultural events in the city. Of our department, we decided to elaborate this huge database together with the ICUP, that's our administration partner of the project. And with this database, with different criteria, we analyzed which will be the most important cases to develop in deep. Therefore, we selected 12 cases that we have been developing interviews, ethnographic research, surveys, trying to understand this relation between events and public space and inclusivity. After that, we developed the cartography of events, cultural events in the city of Barcelona. Is the one that I would talk to you today. And then the last outcome is textual analysis that we develop about the texts of the open speeches. In that point, we analyzed in deep what we identified the main symbolic public space in terms of cultural events in the city. So when we talk about cultural events in the city, we just take over. There are some noises. I don't know if someone has the micro on beside me. Okay, there it's up. Again, cultural events in the city, we identify all cultural events that has some kind of link with administration, Barcelona City Council, Department of Culture. Why we decide that? To take care about those events that are recorded in some kind. So we identified what we call the cultural industry events, film festivals, music festivals, etc. We had the source from the City Council. Also, we identified what we call the popular and traditional cultural events. We have different sources also from the City Council, but also for different kind of bibliography. And then the ones that we call cultural diversity events, events that are recorded by the social department of the administration. These are the Chinese New Year, the events of different communities like Pakistan, China, Philippines, etc. Then we developed this huge database by identifying the events, 340 events. Again, we can develop that. We have been developed that just for 2019, because as you know, 2020 and 2021 have been really different, and we try to keep on track what happened before pandemic. Therefore, we identified 340 events. From them, 2,268 locations, because we identified different types of locations. So locations that we identify for their characteristics, but also by their hierarchy, identifying the main venue and the second venue from all of these events. Also, we analyze different typologies of event by their characteristics, but also by their use of the space. To identify the first and the second location, we classified them by different indicators, observing if there is a symbolic space. That means if this is a space where the opening speech is happening, or there is some kind of importance in the program from this space, etc. Also, we identified a main space by if there is an inaugural ceremony, also a closing ceremony, or also by the number of activities. If there is a space where happen the most activities, etc. So we identified different these different categories, which is the main space or venue of the event. With that, we also come to different types of events, not by their characteristics, they mean the typologies, but by the use of a spaces. We identify 322 events that are what we consider general, because we identified just one main space and then other spaces. Then we classified by 8 what we call the city events. That means the main events. Oh, I don't know what happened. That was the last, the next, yes. What we classify the city events that are events that they have one main venue, but also other venues that are also important, and the ones that we call net events, that are events that they do not have a one most important spaces, they work like a net. The maps. We have developed 60 maps with 3 types of typologies of maps. Just an overview what Barcelona looks like. It's the Barcelona by districts. So we have 10 districts in Barcelona. Then Barcelona has also 73 neighborhoods. It's important to identify that because there are many districts that have many district neighborhoods inside. First typology of maps, they're the ones that we classified as univariable maps. These maps are maps that try to illustrate how are distributed these events through quantity of space used, also by numbers of cultural events by type of events, so cultural diversity, traditional popular culture festival, cultural industry festivals, also by number of locations distributed by Barcelona according to if they are city events, if they are general or there are net events, also by number of cultural and by physical locations, their characteristics, if they are indoor and outdoor, or other variables like seasons or etc. So here's some illustration of the maps. We have here the first map where you can see all the distribution of the locations of the events. You can see very strong centrality, but also a lot of other locations that take place events in different kind of areas, not so much centered. Height maps, we develop also height maps. Here another illustration by main and secondary spaces. If we could see at the first map that the events are most centered in the central districts and neighborhoods, if we see the secondary space used by events, also there are a kind of centrality, but also there are other districts that take a place there. Another example are the maps. This map is an illustration about the quantity of events that they use outdoor or indoor spaces. It's very interesting that even this centrality, that the spaces that are used by events, not in the central spaces, are used basically by outdoor spaces. They're the green slots here, and the other slots, the yellow slots, are the events that are used both indoor and outdoor, and the other slots are indoor. Interesting indoor spaces are more central. The next slide, it's an illustration also about the season. So when are happening these events, and for example, the blue spot is winter, the yellow, the green spot is spring, then we have summer with the red spots. It's very interesting to see how central it is, for example, in winter, and in summer, the centralization are in other districts and spots in the city. I'm trying to keep on track, therefore maybe quickly, but we can have another opportunity to talk deep more about that. So the other type of maps are what we call the in-zoom maps. We made the same of the first description maps, but zoom, focusing on a district and a neighborhood. Here we have the example of the district of San Martí, and then the in-zoom of neighborhood of Poplano. Also by the second small map here on the right side, you could see by typologies of events.
2 minutes, please. Yeah.
Sorry?
2 minutes. 2 minutes, please.
2 minutes. Yeah, then I go to the three, the other maps. The other ones are the multiple yellow maps, what we cross variables like location of events by income of families' income, by municipal facilities, by density, by tourism taking care about overnights, mobility of immigration. Few examples of that, because again, we have more than 60 maps. Here is the map about population and density. You could see we make this analysis across variable analysis by quartiles, and we identify that the dark red is where more population is and where more events or location of events are happening. It's just an illustration, but it's interesting in this map is to see also that it's not only this very dark green, red, we have other kind of reds that are also interesting in other areas. Other illustration here is about immigration that I think is very important here for the season that we have today. So dark red again is where most immigration lives, and quantity of people from immigrant background and most location events are happening. So also interesting in this map is to see that the centralization again makes a role, but also there are other districts with other neighborhoods that are very important in terms of migration that are also happening different kind of events. So here we could see some conclusions. It's very difficult to make conclusion at this point because we are still analyzing that. But some of the ideas that I think it's interesting to underline is that the distribution, of course, is not uniform. Of course, cultural industry events are more centered than others, but also that the neighborhoods are very important for traditional popular cultural events and outdoor events. That is very interesting to identify also that there are several kind of crowns of intensity of use of spaces, like central districts like Ciutat Bella, but also neighborhoods like Poble Nou or l'Eixample Dreta. It's very interesting also to underline that there are not links, really close links between neighborhoods with much immigration and different type of events like cultural diversity events. But also we have seen the central neighborhoods with a large population also take a lot of locations of events, although the typology of the most peripheral of some of the second crown events also are other typology, like traditional popular cultural events. With that, we're concluding that reclaiming representation and occupation, the spaces for different kind of communities, and how are they recognized is also very important for us. So we're still working on that. We work now in deep in the 12 cases that we have, and we observe also four cultural diversity events in deep, and we're still observing which kind of spaces used. But again, the maps give us the first overview how the occupation and using of intensity, different kind of intensities of the spaces in the city for different kind of events. At that point, I need to say thank you, gracias in my mother languages. And also I underline here to try to be a bit inclusive. Urdu, that is for the Pakistan community that we are in contact now. Tagalog with the Salamat for the Philippines and with the Chinese, because we are also in intense work with them analyzing the new year of Chinese community. Thank you very much for all. I will love to pass the word and the floor to Andrew with the I see now here Anna. Anna, thank you very much to take over.
Yeah.
So
thank you very much, Albert. Thank you.
Then I give the floor to you. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi, Andrew.
Hello there. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Sorry about that. My entire system froze then. So can I just start by saying what a pleasure it's been to work on this Festspace project. There's been a wonderful set of people involved, and it's been a real pleasure to be involved. Sorry about all the drama this morning. I hope David and Bernadette and Theresa are all okay. Just to give you a flavour of what we've been doing in London, really. So this is the London team for the Festspace project on this slide here. Our work has been quite focused. So we've been looking at how festivals and events affect the inclusivity of London's parks. So the work is almost exclusively based on sort of park settings. And we've been doing, as you would imagine, quite a lot of research over the past 2 to 3 years. So really that's in two separate sort of phases and two separate sections. So first of all, we've been doing some London-wide analysis. We have been looking at the history of the use of London parks as event venues. We have also been doing some work with the users of parks, looking across London, asking users of parks what they think about the festivals and events that are staged in their parks. But we also wanted to really focus on one particular space and do a very detailed analysis of one particularly interesting case study. So we always wanted to look at Finsbury Park in North London, because this is a really fascinating example of a contested space where there are lots of interesting festivals and events happening every year, some of which are highly controversial. And that was obviously one of the reasons we were interested in looking at it. So what we did was try and immerse ourselves in that park. The researchers involved in the project spent a lot of time in the park. We did lots of very detailed observation work, and we got involved in lots of park events and park activities. So that was really what happened. And then obviously March 2020, everything changed and we had to adapt our fieldwork plan. And obviously then at that point, we did a lot of online work. We did lots of interviews with key stakeholders, obviously using Zoom and other online platforms. So in some ways that was a real interruption to what we wanted to be a year-long sort of observation study, which ended up being slightly shorter than that. Since August last year, we have been able to get back into our case study park, and we did lots of interesting observation work and filming at the festivals and events that occurred last August, which was again really interesting because obviously they were the first major events that had been staged in the park since the pandemic. And since the project started, we've taken on a brilliant new PhD student who's actually now continuing our observation work. So there will be a legacy of the project going forward, and she's also doing detailed observation work in our case study park. So the idea really was just to try and understand the dynamics of festivals and events by attending them, but also by thinking about how the park operates on a day-to-day basis, so we could understand how festivals and events relate to and correspond to or interrupt the everyday life of a park. And again, I'm not going to speak for very long this morning. You've probably had enough PowerPoint presentations already. So just to really summarise very quickly the outcomes of our work and some of the recommendations we've made from it. So Finsbury Park is funded entirely by the festivals and events it stages now. The programming is very driven by financial motivations, and that does create big problems in terms of people being excluded, but also some other events being squeezed out of the park. But we've also been quite surprised, I suppose, in that some of those commercial festivals do have inclusive elements. So we've been looking at Wireless, which is the UK's largest Black British music festival. So again, and other festivals which have a sort of more progressive element. So we've, and that's been a sort of emerging finding, thinking about the sort of complexities of these events and the ways in which they both exclude but also have inclusive elements. The second thing really is that we have observed that some festivals and events can make spaces more inclusive, but that in Finsbury Park and other spaces in very diverse cities, often their main function is to actually celebrate, highlight, make visible existing diversity. So in some ways, it's not necessarily transforming the park, it's actually just showcasing the diverse set of users and uses of the park that do often exist on an everyday basis. So we've also made lots of recommendations from our research, and again, this is a very oversimplified perspective, and we've only got a short amount of time, but one thing we've looked at is this whole idea of programming parks and thinking about how we integrate festivals and events with other park activities and with everyday use. So how those things all come together and how we can sort of plan that as a cohesive whole. Obviously, we've had some strong ideas about how we could actually think about minimising some of the exclusionary effects of some of the fenced festivals that do happen in Finsbury Park and other London parks. And finally, we've sort of come up by focusing on one case study in particular, which we thought was a very good example of an inclusive festival that made a really positive contribution to the inclusiveness of the public space. We've sort of generated a set of characteristics which really, we think, typify an inclusive park festival. So I'm going to give you a little bit more information, or I'm going to show a film in a few seconds, which helps to illustrate those characteristics. So that's the Latino Life in the Park film, which I'll introduce in a second. As David mentioned previously, we also published some other public-facing outcomes from the work. We have lots of academic outputs planned too, and some in review, some in press, so over the next few months and couple of years, we hope you'll be able to read some of the academic work that's come from the London-based part of the project. But just now, really to introduce the film. So we're going to show a film. It's actually 20 minutes long. We may only show the first 13 minutes, depending on how we're doing for time. But the idea here really was to try and capture what we thought was interesting and inclusive about this festival. And when we did our research in 2019, this festival was consistently mentioned by lots of different people as a really good example of a festival that really made a difference and helped to make Finsbury Park, not only helped to make it more inclusive, but helped to celebrate the diversity of the park and the diversity of users of the park. So I'll leave it there, but what I'd like you to do now is you can obviously go and get a coffee and you can have a little break as well during this, but we're going to show the film that we've made about Latino Life in the Park, which is a festival that was staged in August 2021. Thank you.
Thanks to all of the speakers. I think that was an incredibly in-depth and interesting insight into some of the research and crossing so many different areas and bringing up so many different points for discussion. And with that in mind, I'm actually going to move to questions. And I see, Greg, you have your hand up, so maybe you'd like to take the floor first.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Great. I'm amazed about the video, and sorry I was late to the actual conference, so I missed the start of it. But there is an existing festival in South Dublin called the Flavours of South County Dublin, which is a multicultural event. It's a celebration of the ethnic and sort of cultural diversity of people living and working in the South Dublin County Council region. And we bring it together through the offset of a food festival. Initially, we were contacted by sort of South Dublin County Council to run a festival on behalf of their social inclusion department. And we very quickly sort of said to them, sort of like, it's great, well, let's do that. That can be our goal, but let's avoid sort of pigeonholing it under the frame of sort of social inclusion. Let's do something that's sort of open to everybody, and let's frame it within the context of a food festival. And we've been running that since 2017. Obviously, we had a hiatus in sort of 2020 and 2021. So there are sort of elements like that already happening within sort of the greater Dublin area. But we're struggling with funding now because sort of the social inclusion department no longer has been given sort of funding for the event, and we're now sort of clambering with the arts section to try to actually save the event for 2022. I can't hear.
Teresa, on your own booth here. Sorry, mute.
Sorry about that, I was on mute. Okay, thanks, Greg. So issues with funding. Anybody want to address that from the panel? Maybe the panel members would switch on their cameras there.
I can say something about that a little bit.
Great, thanks, Andrew.
If you do watch the second bit of the film, we do some interviews with the organizer. And again, one of the big issues that they have with that particular festival that we talked about there was the fact that obviously it was free and non-ticketed, and therefore they're very reliant on grant income and other sort of more precarious sources of income, and you know, it's a perennial problem. So, and again, one thing that we've definitely observed in London through our research is that actually there are now fewer free music festivals, for example, than there used to be, and partly because it's hard to sustain those festivals, but also it makes more sense for the park authorities to hire the park out for a more lucrative festival, and they make a bit of money, you know what I mean? So there's a sort of lots of different forces working against these free festivals, and with public subsidies really being reduced and local authorities sort of funding being reduced. You'll hear from this afternoon from the organizer of that festival, but she's now very reliant on our Arts Council funding, on generating money from bar sales and from much more precarious sources of income. So we're really keen to try and make sure that we protect free festivals in London, because I know in the multicultural festival sphere they're still very common, but in terms of free music festivals, they are becoming increasingly scarce, and they used to be a much more common feature of London's parks.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. I have a question here. I think, Christina, it's for you really. Are there situations in Gothenburg and elsewhere where rights to access have been eroded to facilitate festivals and economic value? So, for example, to reduce inclusivity, to increase economic development?
Well, for sure, I think it is. And I think the problem here is how that the notion or concept of inclusion tends to be rather unclear many times. So it might be that we see different types of rebound effects. For example, it's inclusive in one way and exclusive in another way, that you don't really look at it from the perspective of public space, but only from a tourism perspective. So yes, I would like to say that even though we have a great number of good examples, it's many times it tends to be what you say. It's not a strategic decision, and it's not evaluated in a strategic way. So it tends to be more about randomness. And I think the really good examples that we see a lot of from the other projects here in Festspace, they are, like we already stated, they are community driven. And it's nice for the governments to have a lot of community driven festivals that are inclusive, because then they don't have to invest in them themselves. But it's a hard struggle for these community-driven festivals to survive, as we already touched upon.
Thanks, Christina. I think you brought up the point there about the fact of inclusivity is so relative, and a few of you have touched on that already today, that it really depends on the perspective you're coming from as well, and what you want to achieve by inclusivity and what it means to you, I suppose. Another question, David, for you about Govan Hill, and to the extent to which it has fed into gentrification in the area.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think it is a really challenging one. I think the colleagues in Govan Hill would indicate that that's not yet been the case, that house prices and otherwise haven't yet kind of risen in the way that we might have seen in other areas. But certainly when you are in the periphery of the area now, you do experience what you might call hipster pubs and restaurants and bars popping up. So there is certainly that danger, I think, in the context of it. But of course, for the people living in Govan Hill, for this area to be more attractive as a place to live, better quality housing, for example, and improvements to the public realm and civic environment is also really valuable. So it's that kind of the point at which the balance tips towards people being squeezed out because of increased housing prices and the like is the real issue. There's not a huge amount of there's a lot of local authority owned, council owned housing association homes in that area too, which probably prevents that from being an issue in the immediate term. But there's no doubt that when people do come from the wider south side of the city now to that area, so it's not absolutely not driven as a touristic focused festival event, but over the years it's become something that more people want to go into. So there is that. But I think at this point it's not there, but it's certainly something that I think the people in the area and the organisations supporting there are very conscious of.
Okay, thanks, David. Alba, there's a question about your mapping here. Sorry, I've just misplaced it. Sorry. I'll come back to that, actually. I might take a question, Flora, and I'll come back to that question. Somebody has their hand up there. Just see.
I can add
Barbara, I think you have your hand up there. Sorry, Alba, I'll come back to you in a second. Barbara, if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. I hope I'm not jumping some kind of line right now. I can't
You're fine.
figure out how to move the chat around. You just mentioned now the unclear notion of the inclusion as a term. But I was actually wondering, I mean, we heard with different projects, especially the neighborhood festivals, what kind of like generally working definition has been used. There's a lot of talking about cultural diversity, a lot of questions of economic accessibility. Can maybe individuals have a brief reflection, not just for their particular kind of festival, but more in general sense for the project of Festspace in general? What is your working definitions that you're going with in terms of inclusion? Is that a practice? Is it a value? Is it a policy? What is inclusion?
Don't know who'd like to take that question. David, maybe you? David, have we lost you? Andrew, would you like to come in there?
Yeah, I can come in. I mean, this is obviously the $1 million question in some ways, or this is really important. And I think one thing we've tried to do is what we're interested in is not necessarily inclusive festivals, like what makes an event inclusive. What we've been trying to focus on is how festivals and events might actually contribute to the inclusiveness of public spaces. And they're like related things, but they're not exactly the same thing. So you can have an inclusive sort of festival, or festival that adopts some inclusive policies, but that doesn't necessarily mean it makes a wider contribution. So that makes it, that muddies the water even further. So we've also been thinking about, you know, what makes an inclusive public space, which again is also a very contested and very difficult thing to pin down. I mean, we've looked at various things around accessibility, definitely around making sure that as many people as possible can engage. About relatedness, making sure that this, you know, can be, that people feel affiliated to this. But I think it's a really important question, and we have focused in particular on particular types of inclusivity. So this idea of including people from different migrant communities, and focusing on like including people from a wider section of economic or socioeconomic classifications, just because it's such a bewildering field if we're trying to think about inclusion, you know, per se.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Brenda, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I'll just come in there, Barbara. I mean, of course, that's a huge question. And all I was going to say was, of the concepts that we were dealing with, it is the biggest and the stickiest. And I suppose as we started the project, I think it was probably the one that we were least adept at. And I think in the, in the academic literature, it's the concept, I suppose, that is the least understood. And I think as we've moved through the project, I think colleagues will agree with me, we have made headway in getting our heads around it a little bit more. And maybe now we're ready now to apply for another project, you know, to really start digging into it, maybe along some of those lines that you drew out there. You know, is it a process? Is it a policy? How might we break it down and start to think about it in a little bit more conceptual depth? Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. It's really exciting. I can see we're going to have more work to do. I know that's not an answer to your question, but it's a comment.
Okay, thanks, Brenda. Alba.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for pointing out this question, Barbara. It's a question that we have been working along and discussing along with our teams. It's complicated to make a definition, but trying to come up with this comment that you also made about, and we have seen also in the comments and the chat, would we classify, for example, in Barcelona project on cultural diversity events? That means diversity in terms of non-link only with a strong community. So that means we talk a lot on practitioners, but also academics, about community events, but these community events are for us a bit limited on events that are representation of a certain culture or a certain community. And talking about diversity events, we include there different kind of perspectives in identifying variability of participants in these events. Not only, and participants, it means people that also develop the event, not always are observers or audience. So because these kind of events happening in the public space generally, and outdoors, participants are a really active part of events. Therefore, is another kind of perspective how we can identify which ways this space constructed by events in public space develop this kind of inclusivity. So that's just a comment on your question.
Thanks, Alba. Christina, you wanted to come in there as well?
Yes, I mean, I agree with my colleagues, but I might add that for me, it has been a lot about being sensitive to the context. So in Gothenburg, for example, we struggle with certain inclusivity issues. We are a very segregated city, for example, and that's something that has sort of led me in certain directions when I try to understand the concept of inclusivity in the studies I've been working in. But then again, I also agree that it's an extremely slippery concept, and we have to be careful. And I think we might, like Bernadette said, we have been able to take some small steps in the right direction, but and also to add, I would like to add that practitioners need to be aware of that it is a slippery concept, and in the governance context, it needs to be problematized like we do now, and linked to the issues that the CTR is dealing with.
Thanks, Christina. And thanks, everybody, for your questions. I know there's some there that aren't answered yet, but what we'll do is we'll ask the partners to maybe engage with you in the chat. And now we're going to move and take a break. I'm sure you'll all be glad to have a coffee break. First of all, I just want to thank our 5 speakers. Presentations were incredibly insightful. Thank you for that. Any videos that are available, we'll be posting links on the Eventbrite page and also in the chat. So if you want to watch some of the videos, the Dublin one this morning, Barcelona the video, and also the London video, we'll have links available to those in the chat and on the page. Okay, so we're going to take a break until 11:45, and after which we're going to move to our parallel sessions. You've all been provided with links to 2 parallel sessions. You'll find them on the event page where Eventbrite page where you might have entered this morning. We also emailed you yesterday with details. You'll find it on that. But we'll also put the links into the chat in the main session here, so that if you can't find those, you'll certainly find it here. So when you come back from your coffee break at 11:45, we ask you to choose a parallel session, click on the link for the one that you want to attend, and we will see you in the parallel sessions. Thanks again, everybody, for this morning's session, and see you after the break.